We are continuing with the third and last session on the history of how we have arrived with this whole sanctuary business. And what's important to note, that whole era ended with judgment, was the focus on judgment. That was a scary thing. Judgment was all about. And so we talked with you about M.L. Andreasen, his book that would set the tone in our church, literally for the next century, was the last generation perfection theology and the judgment. And he was formidable theologian. Just look at this. He was professor at our seminary in Washington, D.C., there in Tacoma Park, for almost 14 years. He was also serving during this time as General Conference Field Secretary. Now that tells you his impact and significance. What's interesting that in his younger days, he was actually dean and professor and director of Danish, Norwegian Seventh-day Adventist school there in Minnesota. And this is an interesting picture from archive with him seated there in the center. And remember when we talked with you about Ballinger? He wanted to be part of that discussion, but at that time he was only 29 years old, turning on 30. They didn't take him seriously, so he had to wait outside for them debate. Now, I want to put a little advertisement. I personally enjoyed the Adventist History Project on my Spotify, and it's on a YouTube. And Mathew, Lucio has done a great job covering every possible caveat of Adventist history. And I know you listen to some of his podcasts too, right? I've listened to both seasons, all episodes twice. Okay. It's deep. He has a special episode on a Great Dane, Andreasen, and he goes in details of his impact and his later struggle. But I'm sharing this because you want to understand that period. This is World War II, from 1937 into the late 1940s. After World War II, there is a fear. Would there be Third World War? Would that be Armageddon? The Cold War is emerging, that whole distancing between the communism and the West, right? And so we as a church called together for a new Bible conference for the new generation. Branson was the president at the time, and it was a significant Bible conference. Out of that conference would come up with our first attempt on Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary. Now, these are tangential issues, but I want to set this to understand that for almost 3 decades, we have kind of been coasting, stale. There's no development in sanctuary. What Andreasen said, and he kind of affirmed Uriah Smith, that was it. That was set. And then something happened in the 50s. East Pennsylvania Conference President Andrew starts dialogue with Donald Barnhouse and Walter Martin, big name evangelicals, and you know the story there, right?
Cults, yeah.
And so one is the editor of Eternity magazine, which is kind of similar to Christianity Today. Another is writing book on the cults, and we didn't want to be in that book. Okay. King of Cults, we didn't want to be in that. By the way, I've been doing some research, and it's interesting. Seventh-day Adventist churches struggled getting a rented facility in 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So church planting was very difficult because everybody saw us as a cult. Why would you want to rent your church to a cult, you see?
And this part is where it's hard to study the sanctuary as a distinct topic apart from the rest of history. Because the reason why we're so culty at this time is because we doubled down after the loss of the prophet. After she died, the brethren decided, well, let's double down on this and make compilations. And I don't think any Adventist scholar would deny sometime between the 30s to maybe the 80s, we were very culty as an organization. And so it's understandable.
Well, again, we're setting this in perspective because it's important to understand the history behind the doctrinal development.
I have always found it fascinating that even though we doubled down on our theology during the rise of fundamentalism, at the same time evangelicals did, for some reason, that's not when we were developing the sanctuary as well. Even though now it's the foundation of our faith and it is a fundamental aspect of our theology, for some reason, the sanctuary was not the topic of interest during fundamentalism.
Right, right. And because they had other issues to discuss, because nobody else is talking sanctuary. Sanctuary is uniquely Adventist perspective, and we have to be aware of that.
Mm.
So when we got engaged in dialogue, it was not church administrators, but church theologians. And so I'm putting these three names because Leroy Froome, he's known for his movement of destiny, history of Seventh-day Adventist. Roy Anderson, who has written book on understanding Book of Revelation, and Walter Reed. He was our specialist on understanding spirit of prophecy and inspiration and the doctrine of the church. They're engaged in dialogue, and after a few years of back and forth, evangelicals gave us a clean bill of health. Two things were published. Walter Martin, together with Barnhouse, published the truth about Seventh-day Adventists, giving us basically status of not cult. We did not enter the cultish book. We
Yeah.
were considered strange, but not a cult.
At the same time, we published questions on doctrine, which
That's right.
to this day, even this morning, I was watching a lecture where someone said that's the beginning of Adventist ecumenicalism. That's when we started compromising to be like the rest of Sunday churches.
Right.
Was because of the questions on the doctrine.
This book has been most divisive book in our church history for the past 7 decades. Now, I find as a historian an interesting detail that after this, by the way, Barnhouse lost a lot of subscribers to his Eternity magazine. Eternity magazine started dwindling down after that. Evangelicals were upset. Why are you accepting the Adventists into normal Christianity? But it became easier for us now to rent church facilities. The church planting would take a whole new level from the late 1950s because now other evangelicals see us as not a cult, not like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, but as brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, here's the important thing, and this is where I'm coming again to the sanctuary. Because in questions on the doctrine, among five main issues, the two issues pertaining to the sanctuary were sinless nature of Christ affirmed. See, that has to do with perfection.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are not sinless. We are sinful beings.
Cool.
Christ was sinless. And that's what we call another subject because prior to this, even Andreasen taught.
Yeah, seeing the 2 points you're making, that we at the time agree on these things, the complete atonement on the cross, which to this day is what evangelicals attack us the most about, claiming the investigative judgment denies complete atonement.
Mhm.
What we, though, internally argue a lot about is that first point, the sinless nature of Christ, because still to this day in Adventism, there is a faction that argues about the nature of Christ and denies he is
Right.
fully divine. And so I find it funny that these are still relevant concerns for us
Mhm.
theologically. They weren't settled in the QOD.
Once we affirmed this, Andreasen got very concerned. By the way, this is not contemporary picture from 1950s. This is more recent, within last decade. Someone created with AI, this wanted Leroy Edwin Froome for crimes against Adventism. And when you look more, H. Daniels, Prescott, Wilcox, Reed, Unruh, Anderson, Branson, everybody's there. Why? Because they felt that we've betrayed our historic understanding of Adventism. And what would frighten Andreasen is that once we start moving that direction, we will abandon our sanctuary teaching. And
Mm-hmm.
so now on the scene comes this young Australian, Robert Daniel Brinsmead. He was influenced by Andreasen and he was promoting historic Adventism. Now, he's a young fellow. In this time, he's in his late 20s and he's preaching Andreasen's perspective. We have to be perfect for Jesus to come back. He's preaching perfectionism. In fact, he called this movement sanctuary revival. That's why I'm connecting to sanctuary, because he would use the sanctuary doctrine as a foundation for this revival, that we need to be perfect because of Day of Atonement, because judgment happening in heaven. Unfortunately, another decade goes by. He matures a bit, starts reading reformers, and realizes that maybe he cannot continue preaching this. And so he becomes a living illustration of what Emil Andreasen was afraid of. That once we start questioning the complete atonement on the cross, then we sway to become evangelicals. And so Brinsmead writes 1844 Re-examined and attacks investigative judgment. Now, it doesn't stop there. With time progressing, Brinsmead would abandon even evangelical Christianity. He would turn universalist.
But this is common for anyone who goes into the assurance of salvation too far. Because yes, we have assurance of salvation. Every Christian believer should have that assurance that Christ does save. But if you take it too far, that's where, well, he's going to save everybody. I'm so sure that even the wicked are also going to be redeemed. And that's not just in Adventism, but in almost every denominational school. There's always some group that ends up going off into universalism.
And so my illustration is this. We go from one extreme to another extreme.
So we went
And
from
here's,
legalism to universalism, yeah.
and here's one and the same person, Brinsmead, from perfectionism and right-wing conservative fundamentalism, one extreme, to universalism as another extreme, one and the same person. Now, he's a fascinating person, and to look at him, I mean, he got involved in politics later on, was a counselor in Kingscliff, Australia, deputy mayor, and he's still alive, enjoying his life there in Australia. But he did cause a stir in the late 60s, early 70s. Let's consider his ideas. Notice, he's not bringing anything new. He's repeating the older, former Dudley Conright's issues. The cross-completed atonement, investigative judgment, and biblical. Daniel 8:14 has none to do with 1844. Day for a year principle invalid. Christ enter most holy in 31 AD. So basically the same thing. There's no two-phase heavenly ministry. Doctrine relies on Ellen White.
Every objector usually centers on three criticisms: the
Right.
timeline, atonement, or the spirit of prophecy. And
Yeah.
they're just repetitive.
And of course, assurance of salvation versus legalism. You see, that's a big concern. And so now comes Desmond Ford, another Australian. Initially, he would battle Brinsmead on both points, on both extremes. And then, after he's getting his PhD from England, by the way, our friend Mathew Lucio, in that podcast that I mentioned, he's got, I know, it's like 6 or 7 or even 8 sessions dealing just with Desmond Ford crisis, with him as a person and everything surrounding that. It's a fascinating story. But Desmond Ford basically challenged our denomination. He was a favorite teacher, and he published this 900. I've got it sitting right there on the page too.
Thick book. It's a thick. Mine's signed by Ford.
Multiple reapplications. He introduced some unique words. He would introduce apotalismatic principle, so multiple applications of prophecy throughout history, right? And so really cool design on the cover. You see those red dots, the blood applied to
upon the altar. Yeah.
Altar. And so he's focusing on what really happened there at Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and the investigative judgment. All right. And so his focus is that in Daniel 8:14, there is no term for cleansing like in Leviticus 16. There's no word taher, but there's a word nitzdak.
To be made right. Nitzdak, the root is tzaddik, as in righteous.
Correct.
Tzaddik is passive, to be made righteous or to be made right.
That's right. And I've just watched another episode by Seeking What They Sought. It's another fascinating YouTube broadcast.
Yeah.
And they are interviewing Richard Davidson himself, the author of this book on the sanctuary. And so I would recommend every listener take time and go check out that podcast, because they are talking to Davidson himself. Okay. And so you're getting the first-hand perspective from the author. And Davidson shares something interesting in the 3rd episode on investigative judgment, because right now our church is working on the new international Bible commentary. So they wanted to call it NISDAC, new.
The new commentary.
But listen to the abbreviation, NISDAC, New International SDA
Okay.
Commentary. And I love it. Davidson, he's playing pun on this word from Daniel 8:14, NISDAC. But the publishers, because we're not publishing internally, they rejected that abbreviation, NISDAC. But the term NISDAC, and we'll explore it more when we talk about investigative judgment, that was the main argument for Desmond Ford.
Mm-hmm.
Missing the point that when you start talking about vindication, setting things right, you are talking about cleansing of the sanctuary. You cannot separate these terms, even if they're not used in the same chapter together.
Mm-hmm.
But this is topic of the future. We're simply outlining the history. Desmond Ford was treated seriously. Notice for a whole week, worldwide, theologians came together to Glacier View there in Colorado. By the way, this would be the last historic gathering of such a caliber because it would become too expensive to fly people from around the world just to listen to someone's heresy. But they treated him seriously.
Mm-hmm.
They've given him a whole week. 114 from 139 invitees were present. That's big.
I want to pivot for just a moment here because there's a lot of current Adventist critics within the church that say the church doesn't listen, they are closed to new truth. We are not. It is in the manual. There's a whole process about how we handle new revelations if someone thinks they have a better understanding of the truth.
Mhm.
And the entire Desmond Ford story is a case example. He had a new interpretation, the apostolic principle applied to Daniel, and the church listened to him and
That's
ultimately
right.
rejected it. So if your local member or local elder thought they had a new light and it never raised to the level of the general conference, it's probably it's probably because the light was not as bright as they thought it was.
So let's look at Desmond Ford objections.
Hmm.
Same thing, you see.
Yeah.
Antiochus Epiphanes, earthly temple. Little horn is Antiochus. 2300 days, not years. Nothing happened in 1844. No stages. Now, for those who wonder what stages we're talking about, well, there's a daily ministration in the holy place,
Hmm.
and then annual Day of Atonement, cleansing, removal of sins during Yom Kippur. So these are the two stages we're talking about. And so again, investigative judgment is harmful. Early writings of Ellen White shaped the doctrine. Ellen White is not a valid prophetic voice. And investigative judgment undermines the assurance of salvation. So notice again, nothing new.
Hmm.
We as a church would come back and respond to say, no, here's where we stand. We believe Daniel 8:14 is about 1844 and is about heavenly sanctuary. We believe it describes the heavenly sanctuary. Little horn is Rome. Day for a year principle is valid. Something real happened in 1844. Christ's ministry does have two phases. Investigative judgment is biblical, and I can't wait. We're recording 3 sessions on investigative judgment alone next week. Notice next point, which is super valid. Ellen White did not create the sanctuary doctrine. And anyone who listened to us, I think by now you understand that Ellen White did not create the doctrine. We also validated that we believe she does have a valid prophetic voice. And we are stating that assurance of salvation is the sanctuary doctrine. When
Yeah.
you understand sanctuary, you understand that your salvation is assured because Christ died for you.
I've always found it fascinating how usually people poke holes at specific details and think that the whole doctrine would fall apart. Like the day year principle, like what's called Sister White's spiritual gift of prophecy. But really, the sanctuary stands on its own. Hebrews is clear that the earthly sanctuary was patterned after a heavenly sanctuary. And all those little details honestly are tangential. Being a student of Adventist history, and with all respect and love for the spiritual gift of prophecy in the church, I believe it is the preeminent gift, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14. But Sister White had very little to do with the development of the sanctuary. She didn't write any major work on it. She didn't,
That's right.
design anything about it. And I've always found it funny why people attack her as if that's a criticism of the sanctuary.
Let's get back to Desmond Ford. Desmond Ford was a very popular teacher. If he would appear on any campus, students would flock far and wide to hear him speak. In response, our church took it seriously for a whole decade. The ARCOM, Daniel and Revelation Committee, would work to produce explanations to our perspective. These books were written. A lot has been produced to crystallize our doctrine. And so we start emerging with more solid stand on this whole sanctuary doctrine. It's during this time that there's a young Trinidadian pastor working in Canada, in Toronto, and he's very popular, and he goes off to study and he works on his doctorate, and he is working on the sanctuary.
Mm.
And right in the middle of this crisis, as a student, of course, he's not involved at the top levels of scholarship yet, but he writes in his dissertation, and then he writes a book, The Sanctuary, and he is asking the coolest question I ever heard.
Yeah.
Whereas everybody's debating, is the heavenly sanctuary literal up there in heaven? He is asking this question: did God do renovation upstairs? Remember, we talked about when we look at the pattern? Because you have to admit that Moses Tabernacle and Solomon Temple are very different. And so Roy Adams saying, maybe we are missing the point. Here are the points that Roy Adams would bring that would change the conversation from literal to spiritual to symbolic, to look for a deeper meaning. Look at his points. The heavenly sanctuary is real, not mechanical. It's not just mechanical and it's not symbolic, it's real. The cleansing of the sanctuary does not concern the furniture. Because you could see where objections came, like, really, does God need to wipe the dust up in heaven and clean the blood? No. It involves eschatological vindication of God's character. The final phase of Christ's saving ministry and resolution of the cosmic conflict. Now, you have to give credit to M.L. Andreasen, because he also talked about vindication of Christ's character. He also talked about the final phase of Christ's saving ministry. He also talked about resolution of cosmic conflict, but he's focused more about us on earth doing. And so the big question would be, how do we connect what Christ is doing in heaven and what is applied to us? Now, notice this statement from Adams. Atonement did not begin in 1844. Rather, in 1844, the role of Christ's ministry changed. You see how he's rephrasing the discussion? Salvation is not a legal work. Both the cross and Christ's heavenly ministry are the full plan of God. And sanctuary truly shows what Jesus is doing now. Now, that is significant. I remember hanging out with youth university students at campus here at the University of Windsor, and an evangelical Campus Crusades booth was next to us. And some of our youth look at their banners, they had beautiful banners, and say, Pastor, why don't we join them? Why do we exist as a separate group? Like, why aren't we just part of general evangelical movement? And so I turn to the youth and I say, look at the posters. What does it answer? It talks about who Jesus was, what he did, and the fact that he's been risen from the dead. And we say amen to that. One thing they don't answer is this: what is Jesus doing now? And this is where we as Adventists say, let's not ignore that the sanctuary is important because it points out to what Jesus is doing now. Now, remember I mentioned that even at the highest levels of Adventist leadership, there is dissent. Here's a direct example of Raymond Cottrell, R.F. Cottrell. He served on Adventist Review together with Roy Adams for years. And shortly before his death, after his retirement, he started raising questions. Is the sanctuary doctrine an asset or liability for us? In response to Cottrell, who was Adams's colleague at the Review, Adams would write another book revisiting the sanctuary. And to me, that's also significant because here's a scholar that reframed the conversation for Adventism. And then 4 decades later, he is still studying the issue. He's still re-examining, revisiting, restudying. This is where we as a church have not settled this issue. We continue studying, we continue discovering more. It would be finally in 1980 that we would add the Doctrine. Right now it's number 24, used to be number 23 before 2005. And the Doctrine is Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. Notice the Doctrine is not called investigative judgment. It's called Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. That is the focus of the Doctrine. It's during this time that more writings would emerge on the subject. I personally appreciate Cliff Goldstein, 1844, Made Simple. Another book, How Dare You Judge Us, God? And I'm going to quote some of his paragraphs explaining the faulty Adventist understanding of judgment when we record the next session on the investigative judgment. Leslie Harding's, and I appreciate his book for all the details, but it was going back to fundamentalism, going back to literalism. Let's look at the meaning of the blue and the white, and why is this used and not that used. So again, focusing on literal details of the sanctuary. And you have to give him credit, he was bringing very deep spiritual symbolism in those details. Here's another illustration of how the struggle to understand sanctuary would impact even our Bibles. In the 90s, a paraphrase of the Bible would emerge by Jack Blanco called the Clear Word Bible. And that was our attempt to present our own version comparable to Eugene Peterson's Message. I find interesting how Review on its cover puts the Clear Word and the Message side by side. You see that? As a paraphrase. But that paraphrase has taken sanctuary a bit too far. Here's an example. In Revelation 21:22, Bible says what? There is no temple in the city, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple. But when Jack Blanco would write his paraphrase, he's going to add a whole paragraph there. The temple I expected to see was outside the city as a memorial of what God has done for his people. So do you see how our literal expectation of temple leads us sometimes to misunderstand? The city itself is the most holy place. And there's no need for the sanctuary or the temple in the New Jerusalem. But for Jack Blanco, there still has to be something as a memorial.
There's a poetic irony, because the series we just did before the history of the sanctuary was how evangelicals often get caught up on a hyper-literal temple in Jerusalem, the third temple. And the irony is that even in Adventism, we have hyper-fixated on a literal temple up in the sky somewhere in the court of heaven. And so either way, a hyper-literal reading of a temple after the temple was done away with at the cross leads to complications on both ends of the spectrum, whether in Adventism or in another form of Christian theology.
Very good point. Now, Jack Blanco passed away last year. His legacy remains. I don't know how many people read the Clear Word, but it's one of those points that we get confronted on by evangelicals saying, see, your misinterpretation of the sanctuary pushes you to demand to add something to the Bible that was not there. Now, we mentioned already that in the late 90s, Sam Bakioki would reintroduce the interest to the feasts and suggest that feasts have prophetic significance. Then Jacques Ducan would write Book of Revelation and explain how the pattern of the feasts explains and helps us to understand what's happening in the Book of Revelation. One of the significant interpretations of the sanctuary came through Dr. Roy Gane. His book Altar Call, I loved it. He was my professor back at the seminary. And by the way, the book is available for free online. We're going to put a link to it under our video. And here are his main ideas. And notice he would take this to a whole different level of understanding what sanctuary is all about. The sanctuary is God's relational system. It's not just legal system. Relationship is more important than ritual. I'm loving it. Sin is a problem of defilement, not just a legal issue. And so cleansing concerns God's presence, not just paperwork. Atonement is moral cleansing, not an audit of sins. God is not interested in digging in our dirty laundry. And this is where we go back to our attempts to understand what does that cleansing means to us morally. It is about the relationship between God and humanity, not about the books. And as you said before, we could be so hyper fascinated that we could be debating what kind of software God is using in heaven, or what kind of books are there written on skin or papyrus or whatever. And he's saying just understand the deeper significance about that. Sanctuary is about God's relationship with us.
Mhm.
And then I love this point: investigative judgment affirms salvation in Christ. It reveals God's justice, not the shortcomings of the redeemed. Just think of the depth of that. Investigative judgment is about God and how He saves us, not about our shortcomings. The sanctuary is the narrative thread of the entire Bible, and we'll see that as we go into biblical perspective on the investigative judgment. Now, Cliff Goldstein continues, and he had added a few more books. One of his cool books is Graffiti in the Holy of Holies. And so again, he's focusing on how God is erasing the pollution from the universe. Because Satan has graffitied his Holy of Holies by accusations and lies about God's character and the whole redemption.
Mhm.
We as a church are grappling with this, digging deeper, discovering more. Yes, the objections continue. Andreasen, a young theologian, also continues writing about Antiochus Epiphanes and preterist views and so on. And so the battle is on, it continues. We're trying to understand what does it mean to us, this blotting of sin from the heavenly sanctuary. How does judgment change who we are? And so finally, the latest book is Davidson's Song for the Sanctuary. I've appreciated because it renewed not only my interest, but caused me to look deeper and discover more things in how, through sanctuary, God is revealing his plan of salvation to us.
Mhm.
And so next time, we're going to ask this question: do we as Adventists have an investigative judgment doctrine? Because when you look at 28, guess what? There is no doctrine titled investigative judgment.
Mhm.
It is associated with what we're talking:
Mhm.
Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. There is no doctrine of investigative judgment, but we talk about it. And so the big question is, when is there investigative judgment in the sanctuary? Where is the investigation in the sanctuary?
Mhm.
Is this whole investigation talk even biblical? And this would be our next 3 sessions.
That, as you're listing those books, there's always more coming out. A good one on academic perspective, The Earthly Shadows, Heavenly Realities. There's a whole chapter in here dedicated to Second Thessalonians 2, verse 4, and how the temple referred in there is not some third temple, like we did in our last lectures on earth, but is referring to the aspects of the body of Christ as the temple and the heavenly sanctuary. And
And
so,
we'll do a whole session on that, right?
yeah. And so
All
there's
right.
always more to read. Yeah.
And so it's not just about keeping you busy in reading. I'm inviting you, friends, to study deeper. Even the books we introduced today, we could do a whole episode on each one, or maybe even few episodes. Like Roy Gane, man, if we go into detail, it would probably be 4 or 5 episodes.
And
Ro-
yeah, this is where that we study these things, we read these things, and what is most aggravating is when I find Adventists don't study their own history and then just make up things and conspiracies, like earlier when you referenced QOD and Leroy Froome. And
Mhm.
I have encountered that people have a misunderstanding of the journey we actually took and to having a better understanding of the sanctuary.
Mhm.
And to me, desiring to have the sanctuary does not necessarily mean you will. David is the one who wanted to build it, and guess what? God said, no, you're not ready to have it. So just because we all want the sanctuary and think we have a clear understanding does not necessarily mean we're the ones who are going to reach that full picture. Just like the early Adventists studied it, and with each time they came to a better understanding like vindication, but with every successive generation, it only becomes more beautiful and more clear.
So, our intent was simply to illustrate the historical journey and the fact that we have not arrived yet. We continue discovering, we continue learning, we continue understanding more, and God will reveal more and more as the time approaches, that we would be ready when He comes.